Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you. Sandy's remarks were very interesting when he described, I think, a structural change in the way Man Group is thinking about climate risk. This is an important idea. This is going to take something quite deliberate and rigorous and different to what we've done in the past on risk and financial management. So I welcome Sandy's remarks and Man Group's support for this event today. Now, I'm just going to cover the science very briefly. We know it well. But it's important to remember that in the recent IPCC report, the focus was on 1.5 degrees to bring to life this idea of achieving well below 2. This is important because about 2 could also mean over 2, or 2.5, or 3. And we understand that that puts us in very dangerous territory. So the idea of well below 2 is still very important, hard though it's going to be, and to achieve. And the IPC identified impacts on food, on health, on migration, that all would be much greater at 2 degrees of warming relative to 1.5. So on specific staple crops, for example, will suffer more at 2 degrees than 1.5. We get more mosquito-borne disease at 2 degrees relative to 1.5. We potentially get 10 centimetres of extra sea level rise by 2100 at 2 degrees relative to 1.5 and a potential displacement of 10 million people additional. So this difference matters, and it brings to life what well below 2 degrees actually means, and this is where we should be focusing our attention. Now, this chart is quite an elegant way. If you only have one chart on what can go wrong with the climate, I think this is a nice representation to show your colleagues. As you move forward towards us looking at that chart, it shows that climate changes in the Earth are non-linear. We don't exactly know the point at which there will be a cascading of climate effects. Anybody here who wants to, in the room, who wants to bet that they know the year that that will happen, and that will start to have an acceleration in climate impacts, is a very wise person or a very misguided person. This is going to be hard to judge, but this is the risk. Okay, and so when we look forward and we're looking at risk, we can't use the same linear approach that we use to many others. Also, we know that climate is a threat multiplier. So the impacts we already have around environmental resources can be exacerbated by climate change, which can contribute to this non-linear pathway. So why does this matter to investors? Now, on the dark blue charts, you see investment plans or investment probabilities under the current policy scenario that the IEA models, and the light blue bars represent what would be required under a 2-degree scenario. So 1.5 would even be a little higher than this. And hopefully you can see the simple message here. We need to move capital out of the dark blue and into the light blue areas if we're going to have a chance of limiting to well below 2 degrees. This is a $26 trillion challenge. This is why investors should care. There needs to be a reallocation of around about $26 trillion from emissions-intensive activities to low-emitting activities if we're to have a chance of contributing to a world well below 2 degrees. The maths is starting to get much clearer. And so for investors, important questions come into play. How will my portfolio be affected? When will the changes hit? When will the acceleration come? How do I start to plan for that? How to identify new market opportunities so I can better position the portfolio? And importantly, in this time of learning, what are my peers doing? What can I observe and bring into my practice today? And so Sandy talked about the importance of scenario planning and looking forward. I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about how we're starting to think about looking forward in our PRI group and with our leading signatories, and hopefully many of you will find this useful as well. We call this the inevitable policy response. Now, this is a view of the future that tries to anticipate what it might look like in terms of climate transition induced by policy change. And so I'm going to lay out a forecast to you. And hopefully you can think about it and start to develop your own. If you don't like this one, that's fine. But don't leave the room without one today, even if yours is better. Have a think about the future. We're saying that there's likely to be an overshoot of the emissions trajectories forecast in the Paris Agreement. That simply means we're running late. Okay, that is, I don't think that's in any question. We see that in the regular stock take process, there's one in 2018, there's another one in 2023. This overshoot becomes far more evident and clear, prompting a much stronger set of pledges in 2025 in order to try and catch up, make up the gap on the emissions trajectory we should be having. And as a result, investors now should be thinking about the prospect of a policy shift within a 7-year horizon, a substantial policy shift, one that actually puts us on a trajectory which the world would choose. Now, if you don't accept that too much climate change and too much warming is a problem, then you might struggle to accept this. But if you are one of those who think that too much warming is a problem, and it is going to be a problem for our economies, and it's going to be a problem for our investment markets, of course it's going to be a problem for our citizens, then ultimately a conclusion like this is the only one you can come to. Now, policymakers might not get it right. It might be late, it might be weak, the response, it might be ineffective, but that's not going to stop policymakers trying. So we've tried to think about the future and how this could play out. And so we're, with our partners, Energy Transition Advisors and Vivid Economics, looking at the why, when and what and how of responding to an inevitable policy transition. Our thesis in doing this is that by acting now, governments, investors, companies can reduce the prospective volatility of a harder policy intervention later. So policymakers can smooth the transition with better targeted policy now. Companies can innovate and invest in clean technology, and investors can adapt their strategy, making some progress on the change and reducing the prospect of disruption later. And so what should investors do if they believe this? They should engage with their companies, they should focus on their governance structures, they should review their approaches with service providers, and they should revisit their strategic asset allocation portfolio construction. Now, today and in the last few months, we've laid out this work at a high level, and we think there's more analysis to do on this forecast, and I'll tell you about that towards the end of my remarks. Now, everyone's seen these charts before. If you are familiar with them, you don't need to listen to this, but if you look at these and you're not quite exactly sure what it's saying, the bottom dark blue and grey lines are a 2-degree and 1.5 degree pathway, and we're heading somewhere in the middle. The current policies, light blue. So there needs to be a big shift, essentially. There needs to be a big shift. And the thing that I think is striking about this chart is that 2-degree pathway and 1.5 degree pathway are not that different in the end. They require some more ambitious policies in the early years, but ultimately it's in the same direction. The box on the side tells us that all the recent analysis finds we're heading somewhere around 3 degrees, even after Paris. Okay, so this is well above 2. 3 degrees puts us in very dangerous territory. We need to be going well below 2. So we're late, we're behind on where we need to be. We thought long and hard about how to convince people that there was a chance that this might happen and that they should take it seriously. Now you can make your own judgments, but here is our view. Our assumption is that the longer we go without a safe trajectory, the higher the level of policy risk for investors, as in the level of the gap that's required to be made up to reduce emissions grows, and the risk of the policy intervention being hard goes up. So investors start to flip into this world where they're actually taking on higher and higher levels of portfolio exposure over time, the longer and longer there is a lag in the policy response. which starts to shift the investor narrative on this. Investors start to put genuine pressure for policy certainty in a way that cascades through their investment activities that we've tried to do over the last 10 years, but not clearly enough in the way we invest day to day. You can make your own judgments about the policy, about the climate impacts, whether it's California, whether it's cyclones and monsoons and tornadoes, whether it's whatever it is. Everyone can see the evidence. The reporting increases clearly, but the evidence of the greater impacts at times of the year they didn't occur before. And I think the security issues one is interesting. We're already working on very fine margins politically on migration issues, which I think on a day like today after a Brexit agreement just demonstrates the extent to which electorates are prepared to put international institutions under great pressure because of migration issues. If we start to see high levels of migration because of climate issues, this is going to put enormous pressure on some of our political institutions, which directly flows into economic and policy risk for investors, for global investors. So this is our take on why we think there's a high probability. But again, make your own mind up. If you haven't seen it, this is the parrot ratcheting mechanism. The idea that there should be a tightening of policies over time. So the important one to note is the 2023 global stock take, 0.4 there, and the 2025 pledges. Now, our assumption in our scenario is that the global stock take in 2023 comes in well under the trajectory we need to be on, leading to much stronger pledges in 2025 for implementation in 2030. Now, without commenting directly on the US political situation, we know that institution building and international institutional agreement is difficult in this environment with the US perspective on climate and multilateralism generally. So we're going to struggle through this year. And so the next lot of pledges may be weaker than expected. Some will stick out on the right approach, the UK and Europe, but others will struggle. And if you go for 2 terms with President Trump, then you're finishing in just before that 2025 horizon. So we are envisaging a shift in the global dynamic sometime between now and then, but we see it running late to 2023. So what type of policies are required to bring us back onto the right trajectory? Now, most of this is not news to you. It's carbon pricing, it's direct regulation, it's supply-side policies like withdrawal of subsidies for fossil fuels. And of course, it's technology that can capture and store emissions, and we need that almost no matter what trajectory you foresee. And so we need pricing signals that encourage investment in these technologies, at least in some form. This is in our future, one way or another. Now, what I'm showing you here is the way we're thinking about this work, because you might want to go home today and start yourself. We need to do more work in this area, and we have some activities planned. But we want to think about the potential policy designs. We want to think about the potential macroeconomic risks. We want to think about the asset level impact. All right, now this is going to be important. This will be important for investors. You're not going to get all the signals and all the data you need at a company level. Unfortunately, we're going to need more asset level data and understanding where they sit on the cost curve, which ones are most emissions intensive, what's at risk first, who loses out in rapid transition. And so PRI is intending to do this additional work, and we'll be open as we are now and share it, and hopefully it will serve signatories. But there's nothing stopping you. If you can do it today, go for it. Because we all need a view of the future that looks at these issues. So a couple more slides before I finish. What should investors do today? Think about their governance. Think about portfolio risk in an IPR scenario or whatever scenario you choose. The point is, look forward and form some judgments about what you think it will play out like. Engage the service providers to make sure they're doing the same. Have a dialogue with company around their CapEx, around their strategy, tangible questions. We're inside a 7-year horizon here on this scenario. So if you're working in the fossil fuel sector, we're well within a planning cycle, CapEx cycle. So this is a tangible conversation. And of course, engage policymakers in a way that we have tried to do in the past but need to do much more strongly now. Because as every year goes past, the portfolio risk increases from policy intervention. This is important for asset owners. And sometimes it's hard for asset owners who are reliant only on their service providers. So if you're a service provider to an institutional client, they need help and encouragement in these areas. But they need to be forming a view because they've got long-term liabilities. And this must come into the governance approach, a view on IPR, an investment committee role, clear engagement with the asset managers, a conversation with asset consultants on this being incorporated in asset consulting strategic asset allocation advice, continuing to work with credit rating agencies. And the last point there, collaborative leadership group. So more peer discussion between asset owners to build confidence, to build expertise, and to influence the way this is taken up in the market. Now, this is my closing thought. We asked our signatories at PRI in person in San Francisco a couple of months ago what they thought the future would look like. Did they believe there would be an orderly transition? Did they believe that technology was going to save us at low cost and we didn't need to worry, the market will fix it? Is there going to be some kind of climate breakdown, the fourth option, so the well above 2 and the hothouse Earth? Or did they think that governments would have a go at some point and it could be disorderly, and the later it gets, the worse it could be? And most of them, that's what they thought. Now, I'll leave you to make your own judgment about where you sit on that chart. But our main point is this: take a view of the future, study ours. If you need a different one, form your own. But the point is we need to look forward, because ultimately well above 2 degrees is not really a tenable solution for citizens, for economies, or for markets. This is a great program ahead of you today. It's important that we're in the how. How are we going to do this? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it phase? And this is a day dedicated to that, so it's a great investment of your time. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy it. Over to Ed.